Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. I'm Alison Stewart, your host of Cut the Crop, and today we're talking about nitrogen and spring grass seed crops. And we've got Richard Chynoweth, FAR's herbage researcher, coming in today to talk to us about it. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Alison.
Okay, so let's just start off before we go into the details of nitrogen management. Let's talk about which key seed crops we're talking about and where they are in their development at this moment in time.
Okay, the largest grass seed crops are perennial and Italian type ryegrasses. So the perennial ryegrasses will currently be coming through tillering, starting to undergo spikelet differentiation, so starting to go reproductive. So the growers won't actually see that for maybe till growth stage 30 in approximately another month, start of September, and then they'll look to close those crops from grazing in late September for the nui type flowering dates. The later season perennial ryegrasses they'll still be tillering. They don't commit to reproductive development for about another 3 to 4 weeks. Italian ryegrass will be in a similar stage, but growers don't need to consider closing that until October. And the difference there being a physiological thing that they can replace growing points where perennial ryegrasses can't if you remove them through grazing or silage. The other grass, so cocksfoot, we'll talk about cocksfoot, which is really can be used as a surrogate for all the other grasses that have a true juvenile phase. So those grasses that produce most of their seed from autumn-formed tillers, whereas ryegrass doesn't need to produce its seed from autumn-formed tillers. So the difference is that really around nitrogen management in spring versus autumn splits and around their grazing management. So most of those grasses will be starting to go reproductive now. So they have to be really careful about what they do from this point onwards. Those crops should have been closed within at least a month ago. So those ones are done from that perspective, and now it's a matter of keeping them green for as long as we can.
So let's talk about when the nitrogen should be going on and what form and how much and everything to do with nitrogen. So
the key thing this season in particular with nitrogen will be to quantify how much is in the soil. So it hasn't been an overly wet winter. We're coming off a dry summer and autumn, and so there'll be large variation between paddocks in terms of nitrogen content that's available, that's sitting in the soil now. So anything that didn't utilise nitrogen last summer potentially has a large nitrogen reserve in the soil now. So actually doing some mineral N testing and working that out will be key to the amount that growers need to apply this spring. So for most of our suggested rates, we have a total nitrogen rate, not an applied rate. So we look at the amount of nitrogen that sits in the soil and what you're going to apply. There'll be paddocks out there this season that'll come back with mineral N values in excess of 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So those paddocks won't need a lot of nitrogen applied. And the growers have to have confidence in our data to do that. So for perennial ryegrass, we've had 28 trials through to, I think the last one was 2017. The average applied nitrogen rate out of that was 135 kilos. That was relying on there being about 40 kilos of mineral N in the top 30 centimetres of the soil. So if you have 100 kilos of nitrogen sitting in the top there, then we're looking at maybe applying 50 to 70 kilos of nitrogen. So
how confident are the growers, though, that the mineral N tests are an accurate reflection of what's in the soil? I mean, because if they don't have that level of confidence, you're always going to get them erring on the safe side and wanting to put more on than perhaps they need.
Yeah, I think they should have good confidence if they are repeatedly doing things the same way. So if they are sampling to the same depth and keeping it chilled and sending it off to the lab straight away, and it's arriving at the lab in a chilled state, so the lab will always give you the temperature on arrival of the sample. So what you don't want is more mineralisation occurring while it's in transit. You want it to get there in a cool state, preferably 4 degrees or cooler when it arrives at the laboratory. But yeah, they've got to also think it's not an absolute value. So if it's 36, it's 30 to 40 kilos of nitrogen. There are inaccuracies all the way through, but they should be confident that there's a difference between 40 and 80. And 100 versus 30. They show those differences show up every time we do the sampling.
And what about timings? Like ryegrass versus other seed crops.
Yep. So timing's an interesting topic. So most of the grasses where you're not going to do any grazing and not supplying nitrogen for grazing, testing could happen any time from now on. So for most of our perennial ryegrass and Italian ryegrass work, the mineral end test's actually been done at closing. So that's not for not until late September for most of the perennials. So that accounts for any nitrogen that has been applied and is still cycling in the system. Lots of people will be applying a little bit of nitrogen now or in August, early September, just to promote growth and get some grazing off those crops. And then doing your mineral end test after that allows you to put a stake in the sand and say, well, this is what I've got post all of that, and now I can look at applying the amount that I need. So for cocksfoots and tall fescues, winter wheats, all those sort of things, do the sampling now, get a good value. It doesn't look like... might be wrong, but it doesn't look like there'll be any massive rain in the next wee while. But if there is, that might move nitrogen through the profile. It doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of total loss this season.
What about the form of nitrogen? I mean, there's a lot of talk out there, about solid versus liquid. Yep. I mean, what's your recommendation there?
My recommendation is that plants need nitrogen to be accessed via their roots, and how you get it there does not matter.
Yeah.
So if you put liquid nitrogen on, make sure it gets to the roots. Don't try and get it hung up in the canopy. They don't take much nitrogen up through their leaves. So if you can get the nitrogen to the soil, get it to the roots, then the form of end doesn't make much difference.
Yeah.
So the application rates would still be the same, assuming the efficiency is still the same.
So a little bit of sort of nitrogen 101, just talk me through what exactly is the nitrogen doing for the plant, and with respect to a seed crop.
Okay, so if we talk ryegrass, really we're enhancing canopy expansion. So nitrogen is, as the cells undergo differentiation, we get more cells per leaf if we have nitrogen in the system. So the leaves are bigger, which means they can capture more sunlight and produce more carbohydrate. From there, we end up with more release of buds that can be reproductive seed heads. So in perennial ryegrass, that's what we're doing. We're increasing the tillering ability of the plant through capturing more light, and we end up with a greater number of seed heads per square metre. That's the key thing. And then after that, we're trying to just keep it green enough that it keeps photosynthesizing through the growing season. So Italian ryegrass would be much the same. We're trying to produce more tillers, more heads, and just keep things photosynthesizing. In the tall fescues and cocksfoots, all we're doing, they've already set their heads, how many tillers that are going to be reproductive. So we're just trying to keep them alive and keep them green, keep them at their optimum photosynthetic capacity from now on. So nitrogen there, the rates we're coming up with at the moment for cocksfoot are actually lower than perennial ryegrass. And I think most growers will probably be applying more spring nitrogen to cocksfoot seed crops.
Okay.
So there's real potential for savings in cocksfoot. So I think the average we're looking at the moment, somewhere that's from 6 trials, might be 5 trials, around 120 kilos of nitrogen, spring applied nitrogen for cocksfoot, which is probably 50 kilos less than what most people are applying. So there's potential there for growers to try and gain confidence by incrementally removing some nitrogen from the system.
So you think that, across the industry as a whole, there's an opportunity to be more efficient with our use of nitrogen and other fertilizers?
There is, from the understanding of if we truly understand what we're trying to do. So nitrogen is an evil necessity in a lot of ways for our grass seed crops. So it actually promotes tillering and promotes growth, which is really good, but it also promotes lodging.
Yeah.
So there's the interaction with how all the other inputs that we're using, so the plant growth regulators, irrigation management, and how that all ties into influence lodging. So we need nitrogen to get seed head numbers and potential seed sites, but we don't need as much nitrogen if we are going to drive lodging through the process. So I think there's a few opportunities around strategically using nitrogen. So we generally in grass seed crops we use nitrogen to promote growth to get grazing. That gives us enough tillers, and then we need to be smart about whether we go and put all our nitrogen on after closing, because we don't have any ability then to remove nitrogen out of the system. So we can use the plant to tell us if it's starting to be nitrogen deficient or not. And we need to recalibrate our thinking as to what green is green.
Yeah.
So we don't need dark green, we just need yellowish green. And it's always, in all our nitrogen trials, it's never the plots you'd go in and look and say, that one looks really good. It's always 30 to 50 kilos lower than that. That'll be the optimum seed yield wise, and maybe even lower for the optimum economically.
Okay.
Depending on how you look at things. So it's not the dark green ones, it's always the yellowish green ones that actually perform the best. They may not perform the best post-harvest from a grazing perspective, but it depends how your system
Well, that's right. You've
all
got to
fits
balance
together.
up thinking what you want to get out of one component versus something else. Yeah.
So we know that if we apply too much nitrogen, in ryegrass in particular, it'll nearly all be taken up by the plant and it'll sit in the straw. So you only need around 150 kilos of total N in the plant to grow a 2,000 kilo seed crop. But if you apply 200 kilos, the plant will take that extra up and just store it in the stem.
Okay.
So we call that luxury uptake. And that luxury uptake disappears with the straw when you sell it. Or
That's right.
if you mulch it back in, then you get it back at some point in the next 12 months. But a lot of it is taken off and carted away. So there's actually lost nitrogen in the system. So the plant actually taking the nitrogen up thinking, I'm going to need that to regrow, but then you cut it off in the harvest process and remove it. So the regrowth, the lower amounts of nitrogen we're applying definitely do influence that regrowth post-harvest.
Yeah. Okay.
That's could be an issue.
So what would be the most common mistake that growers would use, with respect to managing nitrogen?
I think the common mistake, from my perspective, would be not knowing what's in the soil.
Yeah.
At the start. If you know what's in the soil, then you can budget from there onwards. I also do like to see nitrogen split in a lot of different applications throughout the season. It gives you the ability to see and respond to the season and what the plant's doing. Obviously, that's a lot easier in an irrigated scenario as opposed to trying to wait for rainfall to actually wash nitrogen into the soil and get uptake. But
So are any farmers doing fertigation, where they're putting the nitrogen in with irrigation?
there's a few. It's not a common practice in New Zealand, but it does happen. And as long as you don't wash that nitrogen right through the profile, it's a good use of nitrogen.
Because, when you start looking at environmental footprints and things like that, you're trying to minimise the amount of, sort of nitrogen going on because of potential leaching problems. But on the other hand, if you put it on small and regularly, then you've got the downside of tractor movements and fuel and everything, and your carbon footprint goes up. So everything is about just balancing the economic drivers, the environmental drivers.
Yeah, and the seasonal drivers. We can't spread fertiliser if it's a very windy season. That's where liquid would be much easier to spread to and get a good spreading pattern. There's lots of considerations for nitrogen application.
Yeah. So any other take-home messages?
I think the other thing, there's a lot of people starting to look at nitrogen tissue testing, and we've been looking at tissue testing for ryegrass and cocksfoot for a number of years. And the key thing there, I think, for growers to consider is to recognise that nitrogen percentage changes within the plant naturally throughout a season. So early in the season when there's low biomass, naturally the nitrogen percent of foliage will be high. It could be 4%, could be higher, and that will naturally decay to sort of 1.5% at the end of the season. So you can never maintain nitrogen percentage at 4% throughout the whole growing season. As the biomass increases, the nitrogen gets diluted through the plant. So I think as people investigate that, they should be looking at it relative to biomass. And there's a few examples in the literature that we've published, which we talk about a nitrogen nutrition index, and that's using the percentage of nitrogen in the above ground foliage relative to the biomass or the kilos of dry matter that are in the paddock at that point in time. And that seems to be a relatively accurate way of estimating nitrogen requirements, as long as you know where you should be at different points in the season. And that's the work I think we need to pick up and run with a wee bit more.
So is that what, is FAR planning to do some research in that space?
We've had plots in that space for quite a wee while, just to see if we can get some confidence that it works. And I think I've got enough confidence that it definitely works now. So we've got areas in Coxfoot and Seed Rape that will have treatments like that this year. And the growers will see in the results booklets that there's plots there from the last couple of years. So I think it's an idea I just want to get people thinking about at the moment, and we'll look at where it goes. But it's it's the same for all nutrients. They'll all get diluted throughout the canopy. So when you start looking at foliar testing, you've got to know what you've got and what it should be, and what it should be will change throughout the growing season.
That's right. So it's not one measurement,
No.
It's never that simple.
Exactly. So if you're going back repeatedly, it's never going to be the same as last time. If the plant's growing and actually increased in size, it should be lower than last time. But how much lower? And that's the key question we need to answer.
Yeah. Excellent.
So otherwise, that's just a matter of having a target nitrogen. So for perennial ryegrass, we're talking something like 170 kilos of total N that's required, and that's nitrogen you're going to apply plus nitrogen that's in the soil. Yeah. So key thing, measure what's in the soil. For Italian ryegrass, 150 kilos would be our sort of target spring applied nitrogen from closing onwards, but again taking that mineral N test at or near closing. So taking into account what's cycled through animals and those things. And for Coxfoot, they're around the 120 odd kilos of spring applied nitrogen, total spring nitrogen, not just applied, sorry. Yeah. So again, measuring what's in the soil, taking our equation and just subtracting from the total what's in the soil and seeing where that gets us.
Excellent.
So I think there'll be a number of paddocks this year that may not require a lot of nitrogen, which would be nice.
Well, it would. It would. Great. So much in there, Richard. So much. I hope the listeners have got their notebook out because, gosh, fantastic. Excellent. And I guess we've got various results booklets and things that we can put the link in when we put the podcast out, that people, if they want to know more detail, we can send them to that. Yeah,
for the ryegrass, the strategy we've got, I can't remember when we last updated it, but it might have been 2017, 2016. It's still, nothing's changed. Yeah. My key thing there would be to try and actually encourage growers to stick to 175 kilos of total N. What I hear is that the number might be slowly creeping up in the industry again. Yeah. So I don't see any need for that to be creeping. It's just calibrating what we see.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much, Richard.
That's all right. Thank you.
And thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.